Hello and welcome. This is Cheryl. Thank you so much for joining me today. In this video, I'm going to share 3 different press plate techniques, and I'm going to use this Poppy Greetings Betterpress plate. It is a Betterpress plate of the month from January 2024 with Spellbinders. I'm not part of their clubs yet. I do want to do that eventually. But I love the fact that even if you're not part of the club, after the fact, you can always order them from the website. So if there's ones that you see that you like, you can get in on them and you can order them. And the second I saw this poppy one, I absolutely loved it. I love poppies and I just love the arrangement of this plate here. So I'm going to do 3 different techniques with this plate. The first one is very, very simple. I'm just using different colors of Betterpress ink on this plate. I'm going to put it through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine different times. I'm not using all of the colors at once. I'm just building them up. This way I can use a soft cloth to remove some of the excess ink if I get a little bit of over inking. You can see that I have yellow tape around my gray mat. Sometimes there's a little bit of wiggle room in that gray mat, and by putting that tape there, I can make sure that it stays exactly where it is and it's not going to shift on me. And by doing that, I can make sure that when I put my clear plate right on top of the base again and put it back through my Spellbinders Platinum 6 machine, it's not going to move. It's going to get perfect placement each and every single time. I found that before I put that yellow tape on there, most of the time I'd get perfect placement, but the odd time it would just shift off a little bit slightly. So by doing this, I've never had it shift once since then. So if you're having that issue or you're worried about that issue, this is a great solution for it. So the inks that I'm using are the Betterpress black ink that comes with the Betterpress system. And then I'm using 2 of the inks from the Flower Garden kit. I'm using Strawberry, and I think the green one is called Leaf. I started with the lightest color first, which was, in my opinion, the red. The red and green, I guess, are about the same. But I figured I didn't mind getting a little bit of red on the green, but I didn't really want to get much green on the flowers. So I did the red one first, then the green, and then I did the black for the center of the flowers. And then I decided to a little bit of black on the bottom of the stems, and then use my soft cloth to remove some of that ink just to get a little bit softer, just to get a bit of a shading in there without adding another ink color. I'm using the Betterpress cardstock for this because I love the impression that you get with it, but you could use whatever cardstock you want. If you're using cardstock that's not the Betterpress cardstock and is probably a little bit thinner, you might not get as much of an impression, but you'll still get that image, no problem. I'm going to do some very simple trimming here, and then I'm using a Copic marker, the chisel end on a Copic marker, to go around those edges. It just creates a faux mat, and it does it very simply with less layers. You could also use a piece of cardstock as well. That would work just as well. I just love using the Copic trick because it's really, really easy. I already have the markers, and sometimes it takes less time than cutting up another piece of cardstock. I'm just putting this on a red card base just to enhance and bring out the color of those flowers. And I glued it down using some Barely Art glue in a fine tip bottle. I love that fine tip bottle because I can use it for die cuts as well as just gluing down larger pieces of cardstock like this. The last step that I did for this particular card, I just added some dots of stickles on top of that black on the centers of those flowers, just to add a little bit of texture and sparkle. Before I start my next technique, I'm going to use some archival cleaner and I'm going to clean those plates off. These plates will stain, it just happens, but I want to get as much of that excess ink off as possible. And the next technique that I'm going to do, I don't need it to be pristine for what I have envisioned, but I don't want a lot of that excess ink. Some of that ink is absolutely going to transfer. If I was worried about that, I would clean it off a couple of times just to make sure that every single thing was totally off of there. For this one here, I'm using some Distress watercolor cardstock. I like using the Distress watercolor cardstock because it's nice and bright white, so you get the true colors that you're going for. I'm using some Vaseline with a makeup wedge sponge, and I'm putting that on this Betterpress plate. This is going to create a little bit of a resist. I've done this technique before. I did it in January with the Cosmos background, and it created a really beautiful, fun background. I'm not going for that exact look for this one. So I'm using a whole lot of water, but I do want a little bit of an impression where the press plates go, and I want a tiny little bit of resist so that I can really place the magicals. And I'm using magicals here to color this. I don't want pristine coloring. If I wanted pristine coloring, I would have used the magicals or whatever I wanted and done some watercolor. But I want kind of a loose, flowy background, and then I'm going to do something else on top of it. Before putting that plate away, I took that archival ink again, cleaned off that plate. I want to make sure that none of that Vaseline is there. I don't want to possibly ruin any ink pads or forget that I had it on there and transfer it to something else where I don't want it. So I'm using the Autumn Leaves Magicals set. This one has lots of nice fall colors, but for this it's going to be perfect. I'm going to use the blue for the background. I'm also going to add a touch of the green. Then I'm going to use the red for the poppies and a little bit of the copper color for the centers of the poppies. I'm using a fan brush just to put it down onto that cardstock. Before I put that cardstock down though, I used my distress sprayer. I misted my surface as well as the back of that watercolor cardstock. Put it down, it kind of suctions it in place, and then I sprayed the front of that cardstock liberally with water. Now, by having it suctioned down on my desk, that cardstock, that watercolor cardstock, doesn't really curl as much. Often when you're using watercolor cardstock and a lot of water on one side, it will curl over and you get lines of ink because of that curling. By having it suctioned down, I don't have that issue. It will stay nice and flat while it dries. Now, the one thing though is because it is suctioned down and because there is water on both the front and the back, and because it's not curling and letting air up from the back, it does take a lot longer to dry. So this is the type of technique I'll often do later in the afternoon and then let it just dry overnight. I'll usually check on it after a couple hours, and if all of the ink has soaked in and stopped moving, I will go and put a little piece of paper towel underneath that just to let some air in and let that dry a little bit from underneath. So you can see here, you can see where the lines from those poppies are, but you can also see that the magicals are flowing outside of that area. So it's not staying really in that area. It's just kind of creating a loose, flowy background. Now I put my plate back on the Betterpress. I'm putting my cardstock back in there. Now, because I had lifted that plate off in order to clean it, and because I had taken that paper off there, I'm not going to get a perfect placement of exactly where it was before. I'm not looking for that. I'm just looking to have those colored backgrounds, and then I'm going to use some Versamark ink here. I've added the thank you sentiment. This plate here comes with two different sentiments. There's a thank you and there's a best wishes. I'm doing the thank you one for, I think I did it for all of the cards. Using that Versamark ink on there, putting the clear plate to the base, and then putting it back through my platinum machine to transfer that ink over. And then I'm going to emboss it with white embossing powder. I thought the nice bright white would look really nice with those colors. You could use any embossing powder you want here. And the other thing to mention is I'm using this Poppy's plate, but these techniques would work with many of the Betterpress plates. So it's not something that's only going to work with this plate. If you have other plates, likely it's going to work with that as well. Now I did get some of that embossing powder where I don't want it to go. So I'm taking a soft brush and I'm just brushing that away. Because the background is very, very flowy, and because it kind of has a bit more of a mixed media look to it, I'm not looking for a pristine stamping. If I wanted it completely pristine and perfect, I would have just put some embossing powder tool on top of it so that that embossing powder would only stick to the ink I transferred. But some of it is actually sticking to the areas where I had the Vaseline impression from before. And I wanted to remove some of the messiness from that background. I wanted to be able to see that it was poppies. I wanted those stems to be nice and sharp and not have some fuzziness to them. And by using that soft brush, I can take off that embossing powder where I don't want it to go. And you definitely want to do this before you emboss it, because once that powder is melted to the paper, there's no chance of moving it after that. So I'm using the heat tool to emboss that powder, and you can see how it goes from that matte granular color to a nice bright white image. This would also, I think, look really, really nice embossed in a silver or a gold. You could even do black, really. I think any color would work. I just liked the idea of the vibrant white on that colored magical background. And you can see on that background, there's the shimmer from those magicals as well, which enhance it. I have this stamp set here. This is called the Poinsettia. It's a Stampers Anonymous stamp set. but I'm not using the actual image stamps from it. I'm using some of the texture stamps from it. So there's a script one in here. I'm using that with some white pigment ink and just adding some white texture to the background. It's going to tie in with that white embossing, and it's just going to add a little bit of interest. You can use as much or as little ink as you want, and you can also stamp as much or as little as you want. There's also a little splatter stamp there that I put on there, and I love the extra texture and interest it gives that background. It just breaks it up a little bit, and it's not so bright white that it interferes at all or competes at all with the main image. It just enhances it and just makes it a little bit more interesting. Now this script stamp there, I don't even know what it says. It's not even legible enough to be able to read it, but that's not a problem. So after doing that, I really liked how it looked. I trimmed it down just a little bit, and then I decided I wanted some of those splatters to be a little bit more prominent on that image. Now I could have pulled that splatter stamp back out and then done that splatter stamp and then say embossed it in order to get that a little bit more bright white, but I chose to do something a little bit different. I have a little piece of copy paper here. I'm just using the Betterpress black ink, and I'm only using it on the flowers. I'm going to create some masks to put on top of those flowers. While I do this splatter, I don't really want them all over those flowers. I want them more on the background. So by doing a mask to that, I can make sure that they stay nice and pristine as they are at the moment. So this is just the black ink on the copy paper, and then I'm using my scissors in order to cut out those images. They don't need to be perfectly cut out. You could probably even just tear up pieces of paper and just lay them onto those poppies just to protect it a little bit. But by doing these masks, I can keep these masks with this plate, and any other time I need masks or want masks for those flowers, I have them already done and ready to go. I'm just using a little piece of yellow tape on the back of them. I'm just going to roll it up with the tape side out and just temporarily stick it to the front of those images. So it's just going to protect them, keep them nice exactly how they are now, and then I can add the splatter to the background. And by using this yellow tape with it, it's going to come off nice and easy. You could also use another removable adhesive. This tape just works really well, and I had it sitting there. So I have some Spellbinders opaque splatter white here. I have the little jar, and I just took a little bit off of the lid, mixed it with some water to make it a little bit more runny, and then use my brush to pick it up. And I'm just tapping that brush onto my scissors in order to add that splatter. You can do this as much or as little as you want, and then give it a few minutes to dry. It doesn't take a long time to dry. I've got a really nice fine splatter here. That is more what I was looking for. I didn't want anything too big and bold. Again, I'm trying to add texture to the background. I'm not trying to take away from those flowers. Once that has completely dried, I can glue this onto my card base, and I'm just using a nice white card base here. It's going to be a nice white frame that's going to tie in really well with those poppies, and then I'm going to let that dry. I put a little jar of beads on top of it, of glass beads, something nice and heavy because it's watercolor paper and it does warp because of the water. I wanted to make sure that I had something on there to hold it down so that it dried nice and flat. And then once again, I added a little bit of stickles to the centers of those flowers. It just adds a little bit of texture and a little bit of sparkle. For my third card, I have a piece of hammermill cardstock here, and I'm just going to use that black Betterpress ink on the poppy, and I'm going to transfer that image over to the hammermill cardstock. For this particular technique, you can use whatever cardstock you want. It doesn't need to be anything thick or anything. We're not looking for an impression. We're just looking for that image to be transferred over. And even just on its own, just that image by itself would be absolutely beautiful. Now you could color this image now and then do the next step, but I am going to do my next step first and then color it. So I have some Sukwang tape here. It's a nice, strong, double-sided tape. I have it in a nice big roll. You can also get it in sheets. Sheets are a great way to start if this is something that you've never used before, and check and see if it's your cup of tea. If you find that you love doing this, and obviously I do, it's definitely worth investing in a roll of it because it ends up being a lot more economical and it lasts you a really, really long time. So I put that double-sided adhesive over that whole image. I'm taking that backing off and I'm putting some clear microfine glitter over that whole surface. This is just going to make it all nice and sparkly, and because it is clear glitter, I can still see that image underneath. Now, if you had taken the time to color it before time, you would still see all of that coloring. So that clear glitter only adds sparkle to it. It doesn't add any color to it. So that's why I said you could easily color it ahead of time if you wanted. By coloring it ahead of time, your coloring would be a little bit more pristine. However, it probably would take a little bit longer to color. I'm using 3 different Copic markers to do my coloring. Or sorry, 4. I have the C7, which is a dark gray. I'm using that for the centers of the poppies. And then I'm using a Copic blender pen to blend that color out. So I'm putting my color where I want it to be the darkest, and then I'm using that blender pen to blend it out. Now, each time I change between colors, I'm going to use my scrap paper underneath there, and I'm going to scribble my pen on there till it comes clear. For the green, I used YG67, and for this red here, I'm using R39. You can use whatever colors you want in order to color this, but you do want to put that Copic marker or that marker color where you want it the darkest. This will work with any alcohol marker. I highly suggest not doing it with a dye-based marker though, and I'll get into that in a moment. The one thing to note about this is because this entire surface is glitter, and when you blend it out with that blender pen is a little bit liquid. So while it's still drying, it's still seeping out. So you're going to have, or likely have, the color coming a little bit outside the lines. I knew that was going to happen, and I'm okay with that. There is a way to clean it up and lighten it up, and I'll get into that towards the end of it. But what I am trying to do is stay away from the edges of the lines. So I'm putting my darkest color where I want it to be darkest, and then I'm using that blender pen to blend it out, and I'm trying to stay out within those lines and not go quite to the edge, and give it a little bit of room to go out in order to hopefully avoid it going out too much. Now, the reason why you don't want to do this with dye-based markers, many years ago when I'd heard about coloring on glitter, the person that told me you could do it with dye-based markers, no problem, it works. It definitely works. However, dye-based marker tips, the tips of them are not as good quality as the Copic tips. Copic tips can be replaced, and I haven't seen a dye-based marker yet where you can replace the tip. It ruins the tips for the dye-based markers because of the texture of the glitter, as well as the fact that when I tested it, the Copic marker dries within minutes and that ink doesn't transfer. The dye-based marker, I was going for weeks. I would lift, or I would touch my image and I would be able to lift up ink for weeks. So the dye or the color faded really quickly because I was lifting ink off of it. So that color never really dries on there when you use a dye-based marker. Here I'm using my blender pen, and any of the areas where it went outside of the lines, I'm just using my blender pen on that color. It lightens it up. It doesn't completely eliminate it, but it lightens it up so it's not nearly as noticeable. If you look really hard, you can see where it's gone outside the lines, but it's a lot lighter. What you can do is do that, let it dry, and then do it again to lift up a little bit more. Like I said before, I don't mind for this particular one because poppies are kind of translucent and stuff like that. I didn't really mind if it goes outside the lines a little bit, but I did want to clean it up a little bit. So that's why I did pull out the blender pen to clean it up a little bit. So once again, I'm trimming this down. I'm only taking about 1/8 of an inch off of each side. I wanted the focus to be more on the image and not nearly as much on the mat. So I kept everything for the cards themselves very simple. Aside from the sentiments that were put on with the Betterpress, I didn't add anything else to it. You could leave that sentiment off and then add a little die cut sentiment to the front of it, and that would work as well. Sometimes when you use this technique with the Sook Wang and the glitter, sometimes after a while, or if you have this card pressed up against something, there's little areas where that adhesive is exposed. So by putting that embossing powder tool on that, I can eliminate that as much and cover up some of that adhesive. It's something that you don't actually feel when you touch it. I just know that when I've had some of these cards stacked and they've stayed there for a little while, sometimes they start to stick. Not enough to be permanent. I can easily pull them apart, but just something to try in order to avoid that. So this is the final result. I absolutely love the way this looks, and the sparkle is absolutely gorgeous. I didn't add anything over top of it. Obviously, stickles doesn't really work because it already has sparkle. You could put a little bit of glossy accents on top of it on the centers of those poppies if you wanted to add a little bit of texture to it, but I didn't really find that it needed it. I love the loose, flowy mixed media type look with this second one here, where we have the embossing and the magicals, and we did the Vaseline resist in order to see where it was going to go ahead of time. If you wanted that Vaseline to resist a little bit more, you could just use a little bit less water so that those inks didn't flow out as much. And then the simplicity of this first one, just using those different Betterpress inks. Again, it's something very, very simple, but I love how it looks in the end. Thank you so much for joining me today. I really appreciate you taking the time to be here. Have a fantastic day.